Coming off the success of the hugely successful Lord of the Rings trilogy, it was only a matter of time before we were going to get some more films set in Middle-earth. Director Peter Jackson had already spoken about moving on to do The Hobbit at the time of the release of The Return of the King. Despite these comments, there was a huge delay to The Hobbit being adapted. But when taking on the adaptation of The Hobbit, director Peter Jackson made it clear that he didn't want to take on something as large as what The Lord of the Rings was. He would happily take a back seat being a producer, and this allowed director Guillermo Del Toro to come aboard. This got everyone excited, the director of Pan's Labyrinth taking on the story of The Hobbit. This could be amazing. Alas, the film planned by Del Toro never went ahead, and Peter Jackson stepped back into the director's chair. But what would have The Hobbit directed by Guillermo Del Toro look like? In this video, I'll look at how the film could have been different if Del Toro had stayed on to direct the project, the circumstances under which he was hired and left, and the casting choices and designs of the characters we could have seen in his version of Middle-earth. This is Unmade Movies, The Hobbit. After the financial success of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, Peter Jackson believed the film studio, New Line Cinema, was holding out on him in regards to residual payments, and he started a lawsuit against the company over the owed money. This actually led to the removal of Peter Jackson from any development involved with The Hobbit and future projects set in Middle-earth. Eventually though, Jackson and the studio settled out of court, and Jackson would return to the Hobbit project as an executive producer. Guillermo del Toro was hired by Jackson in 2008 to be the director. Del Toro was an acclaimed director from his work on Pan's Labyrinth, and he was coming off working on Hellboy 2: The Golden Army. Jackson and Del Toro were initially brought together to work on an adaptation of the video game Halo Combat Evolved, though this never went ahead and opened up the chance for the two to work on The Hobbit together. Del Toro's vision was different to what we got. When he was directing, it was planned as 2 movies and not 3. It is worth noting that it only became 3 movies after the release of the first movie from Peter Jackson. The original screenplay was for 2 movies only, and this would have seen the first film end at the arrival at Erebor, and the second film would tie more into the Lord of the Rings and expand the world of Middle-earth, as well as wrapping up the story of The Hobbit. Even when Del Toro was on board, he wanted actors to reprise their roles from the Lord of the Rings franchise, which did end up happening in the Jackson movies too. Del Toro wanted Ian McKellen back as Gandalf, Andy Serkis back as Gollum, and Hugo Weaving back as Elrond. Del Toro was also very keen to have Ian Holm reprise his role as Bilbo and star as Bilbo throughout the entire movie. Holm declined this due to his age, as he was nearly 80 years old at the time the film was going to shoot. He didn't feel that he had the energy to do such a large and physical role at his age. Martin Freeman ended up getting cast as a young Bilbo, and Holm did reprise his role in the final film we got from Jackson. Despite not casting Freeman, Del Toro did go on to praise the casting choice, and had he stayed on the project, he would have likely have worked with Freeman. Del Toro did actually cast several key roles before he left the project. Both Ron Perlman and Doug Jones, both long-time collaborators with Del Toro, were up for roles in the film. Perlman had a choice of several roles before finally settling on Bjorn the Skin Changer. He was also initially considered to play both Thorin Oakenshield and to voice the dragon Smaug. He felt Beorn was the best role for him. Doug Jones had been cast as the Elven King Thranduil when Del Toro was directing. Lee Pace would go on to play the role in the Jackson movies. Doug Jones, having played an array of monsters for Del Toro in past movies, was also considered to play the Goblin King in physical form. Eventually, Jackson just used CGI to create this character. In regards to the dwarves, Del Toro wanted Brian Blessed to play Thorin Oakenshield after Ron Perlman decided on a different role. Ian McShane was also cast as Balin, the second in command to Thorin's company. Del Toro did say that McShane would play the perfect dwarf. Ian McShane did go on to play a dwarf in Snow White and the Huntsman. Also, it was actually Del Toro who cast Doctor Who actor Sylvester McCoy to play Radagast the Brown. McCoy had previously auditioned for the role of Bilbo in The Lord of the Rings. Del Toro had different design choices for Radagast, and his role would have not been as prominent in the version of the films we got in the Jackson trilogy. When Del Toro was involved with the project, he wanted the film to have a distinct tone that was separate from The Lord of the Rings. He is quoted to say he wanted it to feel more fairy tale-like, and more in the vein of his work on Pan's Labyrinth. Del Toro also said that he wanted each part of the film to have distinct colours to match the passage of the seasons. There is very little concept art of what was going to be used for Del Toro's vision. One of the only pieces is this concept art of Smaug the Dragon, which is very different to what we got in the final film, and rather distinct from what a typical dragon looks like in mythology. However, I do really like this design. There is some more concept art showing a different take on the orcs, goblins and dwarves, which is far different from what we got in the final film. However, it is not clear if this was commissioned during Del Toro's pre-production on the film.
I've said it in writing, but I'm going to repeat it. I am exploding with the desire of just showing everything. You know, this is the first movie I've been where I become a measured and sophisticated gentleman about just oversharing and being there and being more promiscuous. I have made a vow of celibacy, so to say.
There is more speculation as to why Guillermo Del Toro left the project. He said it was because it was taking too long to start production on the film. Del Toro had already spent 18 months on pre-production, and with the ongoing rights issue, he no longer wanted to wait around for cameras to start rolling.
At this point today, for better or worse, you're as known for the movie you didn't do, The Hobbit, as the ones that you did.
Yeah.
How hard was it to walk away from that film after working on it in pre-production for so long?
It doesn't get harder than that. I mean, it's the hardest decision I've ever taken. I have incredible heartache. I feel terrible about it. It's very hard. It's getting a little easier to talk about it, but essentially it's like you've been recently widowed and everybody asking you exactly how your wife died. It's pretty morbid.
And what helped you make that decision?
There was no other choice. I mean, I kept postponing, I kept fending off the problems, I kept compartmentalizing, we did everything we could.
Do you think once the film gets made that you'll be able to watch it?
Oh yeah, I'll be able to watch it and probably enjoy it.
Del Toro's comments does imply that he wasn't forced to exit, though others believe that he and Jackson fell out over the film's tone and style. Rather than the fairy tale-like style Del Toro was going for, Jackson and the studio wanted it to be more visually similar to the Lord of the Rings movies. It is a real shame that the director left the project. Many think the rushed production of The Hobbit with Peter Jackson caused the films not to live up to the hype. When Jackson took over directing duties, he actually threw out almost all of the pre-production material that Del Toro had worked on. He was starting from scratch.
Peter never got a chance to prep these movies. I can't say that, but he didn't.
The sequence of events that unfolded on The Hobbit never really allowed for that. Almost every morning of the shoot, we're delivering the objects needed that day.
We had a couple of years with Guillermo working up designs, working up concepts.
And then because Guillermo Del Toro had to leave and I sort of jumped in and took over, we didn't wind the clock back a year and a half and give me a year and a half prep to design the movie I was going to make, which was different to what he was doing.
Peter Jackson was forced to step in as director, as it was the only way to keep production in New Zealand. With Del Toro's departure, the studio also considered Neil Blomkamp, David Yates and Brett Ratner to take over the directing duties. Guillermo Del Toro's unmade movie The Hobbit is probably the film I most wish we could have got. Sure, we got the Hobbit trilogy from Peter Jackson, but let's face it, it didn't live up to the hype. Del Toro did maintain a writing credit on the first film, The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey, and I feel that that was the best of the three films that we eventually got. Del Toro hasn't spoken too much about what the Hobbit movies would have looked like had he stayed on board. I just hope that one day we get to see what could have been in the future.
It's fun, but it's challenging, it requires you to have your stuff together. You know, you cannot just I mean, there's no winging it there.
No.
There's no like, let's see, you know, you have to do your homework every day, be prepared, and it's fantastic.
Would you have liked to have seen Del Toro direct his original vision for The Hobbit? Let me know in the comments, give this video a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and make sure to click the bell icon to receive notifications for my latest videos. Thanks for tuning in.